Hi there, listener. Welcome to episode 68 of Prague Talk, a podcast produced by Radio Prague International. My name is Ian Willoughby. In this edition, my guest is Jiří Přibáň, a law professor at Cardiff University. Jiří is a seasoned commentator on Czech politics, so I thought it would be good to speak to him ahead of the second round of the presidential elections here in the Czech Republic. Since the first round, many liberals in this country have been outraged at the language of candidate Andrej Babiš, with the billionaire ANO leader attempting to depict opponent Petr Pavel, a former head of the army, as a warmonger. But given that the bookies make Mr. Pavel favourite, isn't there a certain logic to Mr. Babiš's approach? And if it works, mightn't he then rein in the rhetoric and become a temperate head of state? Well, I discuss those questions and much more now with Jiří Přibáň in this edition of Prague Talk. Last weekend, after Andrej Babiš released these billboards implying that his opponent Petr Pavel would drag Czechs into war, you wrote on social media that the presidential elections now weren't a democratic election, but elections about democracy. What specifically did you mean by that?
What I meant has two meanings. First, if you use the billboard, which is aesthetically the same like billboards of extreme right SPD party, you're making not just an aesthetic but also ideological connection. This billboard in its visual form was a step beyond the democratic contestation. Yeah, this is what I meant. And second, in terms of politics, it's an appeal to something which is talking about the peace so much, but in reality, the billboard is a declaration of war. So it is like a return to the old communist propaganda, which was based on talking as much about peace as possible while launching wars against other states and their own peoples.
So it's a kind of doublespeak.
Exactly. This billboard is a return to the communist Orwellian doublespeak.
I'm sure you also saw last weekend the commentator Jindřich Šídlo. He said that if Czech politics has withstood Andrej Babiš and Miloš Zeman both in power at the same time, it can also withstand President Andrej Babiš, and that the change would be aesthetic. What do you say to his assertion?
I think it's a dangerous complacency. We should remember one metaphor that political regimes can be finished by a coup, the regime change, or revolution, a coup or revolution. But at the same time, political regimes can die slowly. And what we had been witnessing in the last 20 years, especially in the last decade, was a gradual deterioration of constitutional democracy to the point that we saw several outright attempts at the regime change into a presidential system. I wrote about it a number of times. So Miloš Zeman really tried to programmatically change the constitutional framework into a more fitting authoritarian settlement. With Andrej Babiš, we would have the continuation of the same policy. So it's not just a matter of style, it's a matter of substance. And let's not be mistaken, the constitutional democracy is at stake in the Czech Republic as much as in other countries in Europe. And the reason why we didn't end up in the situation like Poland or Hungary is only because of the constitutional framework. And with the president attacking constitution, we cannot afford another one.
If we speak about the tactics that Andrej Babiš is using so far, at least since the end of the first round, how do you view the ploys that he's coming out with?
Andrej Babiš is repeating Miloš Zeman's tactics. Avoid as many debates as you can, especially those where you fear that you could be scrutinized by independent journalists, and build your campaign on the fear tactics. But Andrej Babiš is not Miloš Zeman. He has been part of Czech politics in the last decade, so he doesn't have a hiatus of 10 years hugging trees in Vysočina. And he is not as strategically clever and planning as well as Zeman. So I think that he will repeat the same tactics, but it can backfire. And I think we are witnessing these days that the initial stage of his campaign for the second round hasn't been successful so far.
But can you blame him for taking this approach? A few months ago, people were saying he's not going to run because the polls look bad, he'd be humiliated. Now it looks like this is the only way he can win, is to take the gloves off.
Politics is always a contact sport, and Andrej Babiš knows it very well. But with his billboards, with his campaign, he is taking it beyond the democratic discourse and beyond the value consensus of the democratic parties, whether they are populist or more traditional mainstream parties. So he is basically pushing ANO beyond the limits of democratic politics, and that's why it is creating tensions and protests even within his own movement. He's going extreme, and people legitimately ask whether this extreme campaigning and discourse is turning into an extremist politics.
Is there a possibility that he could run in this kind of inflammatory way because he knows that's the only way to win, and if he were to win, then to become a regular, normal, statesman-like president?
I'm afraid it is very difficult to step back from this rhetoric, especially because Andrej Babiš was using it in the past. So it will be almost impossible for him to become president of the Czech Republic, which can unite the citizens of the country, which can be a negotiator, a moderator of the political debate. No, we would see a heavy political president who would try to transform the system from parliamentary to the presidential regime. And I think this is the biggest risk in this presidential election.
We should also speak about his opponent. Some people have reservations about Petr Pavel. They find it unacceptable that he has a communist past. What do you say to that?
I would say that the past is always problematic, but the question is how you deal with the past. In the end, this election is not so much about the past itself, because it's almost like asking in 1938 whether Czechoslovakia successfully de-Habsburged its state apparatus. So for many people, it's over 30 years ago, and what matters is how you deal with your own past. And in that sense, Pavel's apologetic attitude is much more honest and trustworthy than Andrej Babiš's false claims how he won his court battles to clear his name, when in fact we know that the Slovak system of justice ruled differently.
But of course, some people would say that Petr Pavel hasn't been honest because he hasn't admitted everything about his past. But I guess we're not going to resolve that here. What about the argument of both Mr. Babiš and Miloš Zeman that the president ought to be a politician in order to be capable of doing the job well? I've got to admit, sometimes when I see people with no political experience running for president, I think, why do they think they can do this job?
I think it's a wrong perspective. Czech president has to have experience with politics, but he or she doesn't have to be a politician, a professional politician. If you look at the history of Czech and Czechoslovak presidents, In that respect, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, until the First World War, was the only elected member of his political party, of the Realists. Yeah? And Václav Havel would have no chance in politics. So I think this is an entirely wrong perspective. I believe that you cannot step into presidential campaign nowadays, because we have a direct vote, if you don't have any experience. So for me, a person has to have experience either as a prosecutor or as a judge, as a public a civil servant or diplomat, but I wouldn't say that candidates have to come from the executive branch.
When I first lived here, people were always telling me that for Czechs, the presidency, the president is a very special figure, somebody almost beyond criticism. Do people still have that reverence today?
I'm afraid they do. This is a difference between a written text of the Czech constitution, which grants some powers to the president, but the constitution clearly states that Czech Republic is a parliamentary democracy, not presidential republic. However, there are deep undercurrents in Czech political and constitutional traditions, and they go not to the First Republic and the reverence for Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, philosopher king, politician king. I think that it goes even deeper into history, and that Czechs perceive president as some kind of quasi-monarch. And the fact that Czech presidents reside at the castle is only contributes to this imaginary of Czech president as not just sitting above everyday politics, but sitting above politics as such.
Miloš Zeman will be stepping down in March. What state will he be leaving the presidency in?
In a state of destruction and chaos. So the next president should be rebuilding the house of presidency. And this is, I think, important for the future of democracy and the future of politics in this country, that people restore trust in the public work of politicians, such as president and constitutional figures, and that people can see that not just rules, not just laws, but also conventions and mores are not stupid, but probably the most important thing that we rely on as one democratic society.
On Saturday next week, we will know who is the new Czech president. I saw a comment, a question on social media. Somebody was asking, as we have seen in some countries, defeated populists have refused to accept the result. Is that at all possible, do you think, here, if Babiš were to lose?
I can't imagine it simply for two reasons. First, the Czech Statistics Office is one of the best in the world. So that a couple of hours after the election, after the door closes, the ballot boxes are counted and are open, counted. You get the result, and nobody has ever questioned the result. The system of counting is not like in Chicago. Go and vote early and often. And second, let's not forget, presidential election isn't about the ultimate power, ultimate executive power in the country. It is about who's going to represent the state and who's going to be part of the executive power. So in that respect, I just can't imagine that somebody would dispute it.
My final question, Jiří, you're a seasoned observer of Czech politics. Who's going to win?
Petr Pavel, because he can mobilize forces of democracy against the campaign of negative emotions. And I think that in that sense, it is to his benefit rather than to his weakness.
That was Jiří Přibáň speaking to me there from Cardiff between the two rounds of the Czech presidential election of January 2023. This has been episode 68 of Prague Talk, so there are of course dozens, scores more out there if you're new to the podcast. Why not check them out and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. But for now, from me, Ian Willoughby, thank you so much for listening to Prague Talk, and talk to you again very soon.